It starts with one woman. Her name, depending on the source, was Frau Trophäa. She walked out into a narrow street and she began to dance. No music, no festival, no obvious reason. Just movement, rhythmic, continuous, impossible to stop. Her husband watched from the doorway, confused, maybe embarrassed. He probably assumed she'd tire herself out and come inside. She didn't come inside. She danced through the afternoon, through the evening, through the night. By the next morning, her feet were swollen, her legs were trembling, and she was still going. After 6 days, the city authorities had her taken away, carried because she couldn't walk, to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers. It was thought that a pilgrimage, a prayer, some divine intervention might break whatever had taken hold of her. It didn't work. And, more importantly, by the time they carried her away, she wasn't alone anymore. Within a week, 30 people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. Within a month, the number had climbed to somewhere between 200 and 400, depending on which historical account you trust. They danced in the squares, in the alleys, in the churches. They danced until their shoes fell apart. They danced until their feet bled. Some of them danced until their hearts simply gave out. Physicians estimated that at the peak of the outbreak, the dancing plague was killing around 15 people per day. This is not a legend. This is not folklore dressed up as history. It is one of the strangest, most thoroughly documented events of the medieval world, and after 5 centuries, it still doesn't have a simple explanation.
To understand what happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, you have to understand what life in Strasbourg looked like before that summer. The early 16th century in the Rhine Valley was, by almost any measure, brutal. The region had endured years of failed harvests. Food prices had spiked to levels that made basic survival genuinely uncertain for large parts of the population. Syphilis had arrived in Europe only a couple of decades earlier and was spreading with terrifying speed. Smallpox was endemic. The plague, the same Black Death that had already reshaped the continent once, was still recurring in waves, still capable of emptying entire neighborhoods in a matter of weeks. And over all of this hung something harder to measure, but perhaps equally crushing, a pervasive religious dread. The theology of the time was not gentle. Disease was punishment, famine was divine judgment, suffering had meaning, and that meaning was usually that you or your community had done something to deserve it. The gap between living and dying was narrow. God's anger felt immediate, and the psychological weight of simply existing in that environment was enormous. Historians who have studied the dancing plague argue that this context is not just background detail, it's the actual explanation. The city of Strasbourg in 1518 was a pressure vessel. The dancing plague was what happened when it finally gave way. But that's getting ahead of ourselves.
When the authorities of Strasbourg realized this wasn't going to stop on its own, they faced a problem with no precedent and no obvious solution. Their first instinct was to consult the physicians and the church. The physicians offered a diagnosis that made perfect sense within the medical framework of the time. The afflicted were suffering from an excess of hot blood. The solution, logically, was to let the heat dissipate, which meant allowing the dancing to continue in controlled conditions until the body corrected itself. This is where the city made what looks, in retrospect, like a catastrophic mistake. They decided to facilitate the dancing. The guild halls were opened, the town squares were cleared, professional musicians were hired to play continuously so that the dancers would have proper accompaniment. Healthy citizens, actual paid performers, were brought in to dance alongside the afflicted, on the theory that social support might help the sufferers work through whatever was tormenting them. Within days of implementing this plan, the number of dancers had roughly doubled. The church, watching this unfold, had a different diagnosis entirely. This was supernatural. The afflicted had been cursed, specifically by Saint Vitus, who was believed to have the power to inflict dancing mania on those who had sinned against him. The appropriate response was not music and open squares, but pilgrimage, prayer, and repentance. The church was not pleased that the city had essentially set up a dance party in response to what they considered a manifestation of divine wrath. Eventually, the city reversed course. The musicians were dismissed, the guild halls were closed, the afflicted were loaded onto wagons and transported to a mountaintop shrine at Saverne, where they were given red shoes, symbolically significant in the cult of Saint Vitus, and led in religious ceremonies intended to break the curse. The outbreak peaked sometime in late August and then, gradually, began to subside. By September, it was largely over. No one at the time was entirely sure why it started or why it ended, and despite 5 centuries of subsequent research, that uncertainty hasn't entirely gone away. One of the things that makes the Strasbourg outbreak so difficult to dismiss as an isolated anomaly is that it wasn't isolated, not even close. The historical record contains numerous accounts of similar episodes stretching back at least 2 centuries before 1518. In 1374, a massive wave of dancing mania swept through the towns along the Rhine: Aachen, Cologne, Metz, Strasbourg itself. Thousands of people were reported to be dancing uncontrollably in the streets, crying out and convulsing, unable to stop until they collapsed from exhaustion. Contemporary accounts described them foaming at the mouth, seeing visions, screaming that they were in agony and yet unable to cease moving. In 1237, a group of children in Erfurt reportedly began dancing and couldn't stop, and allegedly danced all the way to the town of Arnstadt before collapsing. Some historians have suggested this story, or others like it, may have contributed to the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which emerged from roughly the same region and era. There are accounts from Italy of something called tarantism, a condition attributed to the bite of a tarantula spider, in which victims were said to be compelled to dance for hours or days. Whether tarantism and the dancing plague of Northern Europe were the same phenomenon, or related phenomena, or completely separate things that superficially resembled each other, is still debated. What's clear is that episodes of mass uncontrollable movement, real episodes witnessed and recorded by multiple contemporaries, were not uncommon in medieval and early modern Europe. Strasbourg 1518 is the best documented, but it sits within a broader pattern that demands some kind of explanation. Modern researchers have proposed several explanations for the dancing plague, and the honest answer is that none of them are completely satisfying on their own. The first theory, popular for a while in the 20th century, involves ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, and that contains compounds chemically related to LSD. Ergot poisoning, or ergotism, can cause powerful hallucinations, convulsions, and a burning sensation in the limbs, sometimes described as St. Anthony's fire. The idea was that contaminated grain could have produced a mass poisoning event that expressed itself as frantic movement. The problem with this theory is that ergotism doesn't typically produce coordinated, rhythmic dancing. It produces convulsions, which are different. And it doesn't explain why the condition was contagious in the social sense, why people who hadn't eaten the same grain would join in, or why the outbreak spread as people witnessed others dancing. The second theory, and the one that most historians and medical researchers currently favor, is mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, though that term has fallen out of favor because of its clinical baggage. Mass psychogenic illness is a real documented phenomenon. It occurs when a community under significant psychological stress begins to express that stress through shared physical symptoms, symptoms that are real and physically experienced, not faked or imagined, but that originate in psychological rather than biological processes. The symptoms spread through social transmission, which is why they tend to cluster in communities that share a common source of stress and a common belief system that gives the symptoms meaning. There are well-documented modern examples. In the 1980s and 1990s, there were multiple outbreaks of fainting, nausea, and apparent seizures in schools and factories in various countries with no identifiable physical cause. In 2012, a group of teenage girls in a small town in New York developed sudden uncontrollable tics and verbal outbursts. The episode was eventually attributed to mass psychogenic illness, though it generated enormous controversy at the time. Applied to Strasbourg 1518, the theory runs like this. A population crushed by hunger, disease, religious terror, and economic desperation reached a breaking point. The first dancer, whether she began intentionally, in a trance state, or in genuine uncontrollable movement, provided a template. Within the belief system of the time, being seized by uncontrollable dancing had a clear cultural meaning. It was the curse of Saint Vitus. Once that framework was in place, others who were similarly overwhelmed could enter the same state. The city's decision to provide musicians and a stage didn't just fail to help, it actively accelerated the spread by normalizing and validating the behavior. The historian John Waller, who has written the most thorough modern account of the episode, argues that you cannot separate the dancing plague from its specific cultural and historical context. The same conditions in a different society, with different religious beliefs and different ways of understanding bodily experience, would not have produced dancing mania. They might have produced something else, or nothing visible at all. The form that collective psychological crisis takes is always shaped by the culture it emerges from.
It would be easy to look at the dancing plague of 1518 as a curiosity, a strange chapter from a strange time, interesting precisely because it's so remote from anything we'd experience today. But the underlying mechanism, if the psychogenic theory is correct, is not remote at all. Mass psychogenic illness still happens. The conditions that produce it, concentrated stress, shared anxiety, a community that lacks adequate ways to process what it's going through, are not unique to medieval Europe. The specific form changes, the cultural scripts that give symptoms their shape change, but the basic human capacity for collective psychological crisis is not something we've outgrown. There's also something worth sitting with in the sheer scale of what Strasbourg endured. Hundreds of people for weeks trapped in their own bodies, unable to stop moving, watching others die around them and knowing they might be next, and no one able to tell them why or how to stop it. The physicians had an explanation that was wrong. The church had an explanation that was wrong. The authorities tried solutions that made everything worse. It's a story about the limits of understanding, about what happens when a society's tools for making sense of suffering simply aren't adequate to the suffering itself. The woman who started it all, Frau Trophäa, or whoever she was, danced for 6 days before anyone managed to stop her.
We don't know what happened to her after the shrine at Saverne, whether she recovered, whether she survived the summer, whether she ever danced again by choice. We know that she was the first, that her movement, for whatever reason, became contagious, that a city watched and didn't understand and responded badly, and eventually the thing ended. 500 years later, we understand it somewhat better. Somewhat. The dancing plague of Strasbourg remains, even now, one of those events that resists being fully explained, that sits at the edge of what history can tell us about human beings under extreme pressure, and suggests that edge is further out than we usually like to think. Strasbourg 1518, a single woman in a street, an outbreak that killed dozens and baffled an entire city, an episode that was real, documented, witnessed, and still, in important ways, mysterious. The next time you find yourself trying to understand why large groups of people behave in ways that seem incomprehensible, why fear spreads, why belief shapes experience, why communities can collectively break down, it might be worth remembering that this is not a new problem. It just used to look like dancing.